As we said in the last video, if you use setTimeout to try and time things, you can't necessarily time them precisely, because if you get a function to call itself a second after it finishes, the period is going to be more than a second, because it will be that second plus the amount of time that it takes to run the function, and we're not really going to be sure how long that's going to take, particularly as it might run on different platforms, mobile phones, etc. So if you want something to run very regularly, so in this case on the screen there's a timer that changes every second, and if you're interested in how this works, I'll put a link into the description at the bottom. Don't forget, if you're looking at a web page and you want to know how it works, you can right click and view the source. With any of the pages on my website, for example, a lot of them are commented and a lot of them are laid out quite clearly. With some of the professionally developed ones or ones created using some sort of tool, it might be a little bit more difficult. Okay, so how's this work? How does setInterval work? So remember our light thing from the video on looping, I think it was, or one of the videos earlier in the playlist. So this is it, as we left it. So we had a button here that ran the change function, and the change function shifts the lights along by one position. So if I refresh this and click change, you see it moves them along one place, and we used a transition to give a slight fading effect so it wasn't quite so jarring. So what about if you want this to happen, periodically, rather than having to keep changing the button? So that's exactly the sort of thing that setInterval is for, to have things happen at a regular interval. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to change what the button does from running the change function to running one called start. So we'll have a second one. So in this particular case, we were not going to have the change function kind of calling itself to run at some future date. We're going to have a separate function, in this case I'll call it start. And what that's going to do is that's going to set effectively the timer to run change every second. So it's just as it's set interval, and it takes two arguments. It takes the function that you want to run, change, and how often you want to do it. So again, in milliseconds. So this means run change every 1,000 milliseconds. So run change every second. So if we save that now and run that. So I need to refresh, and there you go. So hopefully, there you go. So they're changing every second, and regardless of how long that function takes, presumably as long as it takes less than a second, that will always start exactly on the second, just as my timer did. Okay, so what about if I don't want it to start on the click of a button? Well, again, if you go back here, we could get start to run using the onload event or some other event on the page. What about if we want to stop it? Because at the moment this is going to continue indefinitely until we close the browser or if we refresh the page. But can we get it to start and stop? Well, yes, we can. So if we just go back to the page, what setInterval can be or can return is a kind of handle or a reference to that particular event. So you can have several of these things running in the page at the same time. So you can have one thing running every 1 second and something else running every 2 seconds, and it can cope with that. So if you want to be able to stop something, what we need is some sort of reference or pointer. So I'm going to create up here, I'm going to declare a variable, and I'm going to call it interval because that's what it is, but I'm not going to give it a value. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a Boolean variable to check whether the sequence is actually running. So at the moment, when it started off, it's not running, is it? So it's false. So how this works is what you do is use setInterval as you did before, but it has a return value which you can store in a variable. And then you can use that value to stop the timer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if running. Now to stop it, there's another JavaScript function called clearInterval. So you say clearInterval, and then you use the reference that you got when you started the animation in the first place, when you set the interval. So you're going to use that interval variable in there. So remember, interval is just a variable. So if it's running, then we'll stop it. Otherwise, we'll start it. So we could do that. The other thing we need to do, obviously, is update that Boolean variable. So I could put it in here. I could say, once we've cleared it, running equals false. And down here, we could say running equals true. But that's 2 lines of code. So because we always want to change it, we could just put it here. We could say running equals not running. So not exclamation mark, like not equals in Python and other languages. So that just makes running the opposite of what it currently is. So hopefully that will now run. So if we just refresh the page, so change will start it running. But once it's running, it will also stop it running. So, okay, yeah. So that just, but change, obviously not a suitable thing to put on the button now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call that, to begin with, it's going to start, isn't it? And what I'm also going to do, I'm going to give it a value, and I'm going to call it toggle. So also start isn't a particularly appropriate name for that function anymore, but I'll leave it as it is. If you obviously if you're planning ahead, you might want to give it a more appropriate name to begin with. So what I'm going to do then is, as well as starting and stopping, I'm going to change the label on the button. So once I've stopped it, what I want to do is I'll change that back to start. So document.get elements by ID toggle. Value. So value is what it says on it. So with the input box, value is what it contains, but with a button, it's the actual text on the button. So we're going to say start, and then we're going to do the opposite. Now again, I could have done this once. I could have had an array with stop and start in. In JavaScript, you can have true and false as array indexes. So I could have had like a description array with description false as start and description true as stop, and I could have just done it in a single line. But it's a matter of choice and readability. So let's see what that does. So if I refresh that, so it now says start at the start. I'll click start, and as well as starting, it actually changes the description to stop. And if I click the stop button, it will stop it, and the description changes back to start. Now this isn't particularly nicely styled. The button isn't positioned very nicely. Also, you notice it changes size very slightly. So there's not much of a difference in the length of the words stop and start. But if there was a bigger difference, the button would change size. You can get around that problem by just using CSS to give the button a width. So the width won't change when you change the description. So you just style it to be that little bit wider, and then it won't change width. Okay, so that is setInterval. We can use it to start things, run them with a fixed frequency or period, and also stop them by using the clearInterval command as well in JavaScript. Okay, so in the description of the text there will be a link to the 7-segment display that you can have a look at and remind yourself how I've used that in that particular case.